Okay, so last night we discussed about this uh, how to use this NGS application for DNA molecule barcoding method, right?
Yeah.
Now, in this DNA barcoding method, one has to determine the exactly what you need. You need to know the position and the color of these fluorescent levels. Okay. Now, generally, there are five critical steps in this particular whole procedure. First is obviously the preparation of long DNA fragment. Then you have this fluorescent tagging of these polymorphic sites or specific sequences. Then stretching these DNA fragments to make them linear and then attach them to the solid surface. Okay, and obviously the last will be the imaging, and then you have to know the analyze this imaging options. Now, now this all these techniques, they are actually interrelated, and with the choice of one method in each step, it influences and limits the approach one can take in the next step. Okay, so in this DNA barcoding method can actually work directly. You can use either the long genomic DNA fragments, or you can use you can simply amplify a section of your DNA, a particular segment of the DNA. You can take that particular segment of the DNA, you can amplify it, and you can use it. Other way around, you can also use the cDNAs from a particular subset of DNA. Okay, now this long range PCR, this is it's actually a very mature technique, and it has a very robust protocol. And
Okay.
to perform this, you need several efficient enzymes, and these enzymes are actually commercially available for this purpose only. These are actually those enzymes are made only for long range PCRs. If you are going to use another kind of PCR, normal PCR, you then don't require this kind of enzymes, because these are specifically made for this purpose only. And
Okay.
in fact, using this long range PCR is used to for up to 17 kb of bases, and it was really done routinely to amplify all the unique sequences present in the human genome. And some sequence specific or allele specific leveling of these genetic markers, they are generally found on those dsDNA molecule, and that is probably the most challenging part of this particular method, because in DNA mapping, individual genomic DNA molecules are labeled with fluorescent dyes, and they are
Okay.
labeled at very unique and specific positions. And these positions might be a sequence motif, this might be a unique domain. Okay, and this tagging of these fluorescent dyes at those specific motifs are actually done by the action of these sneaking endonucleases, and
Okay.
after that it is followed by incorporation of those dye terminator with the DNA polymerase. Okay, now in molecular haplotyping, this hybridization of the sequence specific probes with DNA molecules to form a very stable Watson-Crick duplex is the only practical approach for SNP recognition, because there are because if you select a whole human genome, there are actually millions of SNPs in the genome, right?
Yeah.
And moreover, this fluorescent tagging, this has to be highly allele specific,
Uh-huh.
because if it is not allele specific, then no genetic informations can be obtained, right? Because we know that
Yeah.
generally we have two alleles for a particular gene, right? And
Yeah.
if it's generally it is heterozygous, very rarely it is homozygous, not rarely, but there are homozygous gene. But if you need to identify, if since the genes generally exist as a heterozygous conditions, so if you fail to identify the exact loci, for example, just you remember the capital T small t in the Mendelian experiments.
Yeah.
So if you simply identify a tall gene, but you fail to identify the dwarf gene, then it won't satisfy your experiments, right? Because
Yeah.
if I need to identify the dwarf gene, then I have to develop a marker that can identify the dwarf gene only,
Mhm.
not the tall gene. And generally, the
Yeah.
tall gene and dwarf gene, they generally differ by very minute amount. So you have to identify those unique minute and those unique sequences are what we require, right? Okay. Now there is generally there has been a variation of this probe ligation approach, and that was used in this molecular haplotyping. And this particular variation or this varied technique and this strategy, it actually involves three steps, and all of these are complete done in a closed tube experiment. So first of all, you have to design a very long probe. Long probe means almost up to 75 to 100 bases. And this long probe is designed and it is actually synthesized with the two ends containing the DNA sequences that is complementary to the flanking sequence of an SNP. It is done because when the probe is hybridized to the target DNA, it forms an incomplete ring with just one base gap at the polymorphic site. And after that, this deoxynucleoside triphosphate, which contains this fluorescent level, they can be then used to fill that particular gap. And this is done with the DNA polymerase, okay? And thus it actually forms a ring structure because only a single nucleotide gap was there. So once I add this fluorescent tagged DNA, this nucleoside, then what will happen? It is going to form a ring structure, but with a nick in the double-stranded probe target complex.
Okay.
And already in the reaction mixture, you have DNA ligase, and this DNA ligase does its job. It simply ligates these two ends of the padlock probe together to form a complete circular DNA probe. And this DNA probe intertwines with the target DNA as this hybridized probe forms a double helix structure with the target DNA. And this structure, it proves to be stable throughout the process of DNA purification, linearization and imaging.
Okay.
And after that, people uses DNA combing technique. DNA combing technique means simply stretching these long DNA molecules into a linear form. And this is actually widely used in genomic and genetic studies. For example, this is also used in optical mapping, in fiber fluorescence in situ hybridization, and also in the genetic disease screenings. And in all of these studies, this long DNA molecular, these are first linearized in solution, and as they flow through a microfluidic channel, or sometimes what happens, they are simply fixed to a solid surface. Okay. And to linearize just a single piece of DNA on a solid surface, the end of the DNA molecule is first anchored to a hydrophobic surface, and this hydrophobic surface, typically a modified glass is used, and generally the DNA is attached by adsorption. Okay. And people has already developed a very several method of stretching this DNA molecule as short as 4 kb. And sometimes people use poly-electrolyte multiplier modified glass surfaces for this purpose, and this is known as PEM glass surface. Okay. And this PEM modified glass surface is generally constructed by deposition of this polyalamine and polyacrylic acid, but the outermost layer should belong to the polyallylamine. Okay. Now, since this polyallylamine or this outermost layer is positively charged, okay, so what will happen? The DNA is negatively charged, right? It has a negative charge phosphate backbone. And as a result, this negatively charged DNA molecule gets easily anchored and stretched on this modified glass surface. This PEM modified surface also has an added advantage, and that it has extremely low fluorescence background. And as a result, what will happen? You are going to get a very low noise, right? And this low fluorescent background is generally achieved by this electrostatic repulsion of this fluorescent impurities by multi-layered charged polymer. And this low fluorescence background surface also makes it possible to detect a unique and a single fluorescent dye molecule that is tagged along a DNA backbone. Because you know that a single molecule of fluorescence is not going to fluoresce much. Its intensity is going to be very less, right? But since it has almost zero background, you can easily detect this single fluorescence molecule. And this individual fluorescent levels on this DNA backbones are imaged using this TIRF microscopy. And this is actually a technique that is capable of localizing a single fluorescent dye molecule even with a nanometer scale accuracy. So it actually knows in which position or on which base this fluorescent molecule is attached to. That is so accurate. And this system was actually first developed by Olympus. Okay, and after that they have developed several kind of fiber illuminator and other kind of objective to and develop the whole system. And this current system that is present is actually capable of detecting 3 colors. Okay, so generally what happens is that DNA is actually or the DNA backbone is stained with this yo-yo1. Okay, this yo-yo1 is a color which can be excited by a normal mercury lamp, and it has a specific excitation fluorescence, and I think that's 488 or 490 nanometers, something like that. You can simply type in yo-yo1 and you're going to get the excitation wavelength. And apart from that, people also use Psi3 and Psi5 fluorophores. Psi3, you know, it gives a green fluorescence, right? And Psi5 gives a red fluorescence. And these fluorophores are actually used to label these sequence motifs or the SNP polymorphic sites. Okay. And as a result, this spatial localization of this individual dye molecule at this polymorphic sites or to the sequence motif is actually calculated, and this calculation is actually based on a centroid analysis. Now this centroid analysis strategy, it actually relies on the observation that this fluorescent the fluorescent molecule forms a diffraction limited image. Okay, but the center of the distribution can be localized to very arbitrarily high precision by fitting a 2D elliptical Gaussian function, and you know which point it is actually attached to. And after this, all these extract images are extracted and then they are merged, and because you know for yo-yo1 you are going to get a particular image, right? For Psi3 you are going to get another image, so for Psi5 you are going to get another image. So after that we have to merge those images together, right? Because if you don't merge these images together, we are not going to know the exact locations, because all of the individual fluorescence are localized at a different location. So once all the images are extracted and then they are merged, and then these individual dye levels are superimposed onto the DNA backbone, and then this whole sequence motif maps are then constructed, and the haplotype is inferred after localizing this dye level along the DNA backbone. Okay, so this is how we perform this whole DNA molecule barcoding method. Apart from that, people also use this technique to perform the single DNA molecule mapping. And this DNA mapping is a very important analytical tool in genomic sequence assembly. Okay, and this is also used in the medical sector and also used in the by the scientists to find out pathogenic strains. Okay, now the current strategy for DNA mapping is actually based on sizing these DNA fragments, and this is done by simply enzymatic digestion of this genomic DNA with restriction endonucleases, or shearing up the DNA by chopping off of whole the DNA by simply using sonication and all. And more recently, actually several linear DNA mapping techniques have been developed, and the major goal of mapping this because when we shear the DNA and we take the DNA out of their chemical state, then what happens? They fails to belong in the native state, right? Because once you keep the DNA inside the cell with all the cellular extract, then the DNA can remain in the native state, right? And we know that this there are several non-canonical structure of DNA. For example, DNA can form a triplex, it can form a G quadruplex, it can form I motifs, right? And this non-canonical structure are highly what should I say, chemical environment specific. For example, if when sometimes the DNA or the pH of cell becomes comes down to a 6, 5 or 4, then the I motif structure is formed. At above 7 pH, the I motif structures are not formed. So to form a unique structure, the actual chemical environment must be maintained. So people now is trying to map this DNA in their native states,
Okay.
because if you isolate a particular DNA from the stomach, then you know that the pH is there is very low, and that's an efficient way to form eye motif structures. But if you take the cell from a blood, then obviously the eye motifs are not that much stabilized in the blood because of the low pH. It is not present in blood,
Yeah.
right? But sometimes it is also said that not only pH, there are other proteins that also maintain this particular eye motif structure without the pH. The pH obviously promotes the eye motif structure, but there are some protein which stabilizes those structure, and those proteins are sometimes active in the alkaline pH or in the pH of our blood, 7 to 7.4. Okay, so even without that pH, you can see the eye motifs. But once you take the DNA, once you shear the DNA and you purify the DNA, then the DNA is no longer in a cellular extract, and that hampers this. And since it is not, there is less of molecular crowding. This particularly hampers those non-canonical structures. Now the DNA molecular combing and this optical mapping techniques, they are actually done on multiple sequence site on a single DNA molecule. And after this single DNA molecules are obviously, then it's same like the barcoding method. It is deposited on a glass surface, and this glass surface, and this DNAs, they have been used to detect this disease related mutations and map several microbial genomes. Now there is a technique called the DLA technique. This is the direct linear analysis, and in this DLA technique, what happens is that a long DNA molecule is actually tagged at specific sequence sites with fluorescent dyes, and then it is stretched into a linear form, and the DNA is automatically stretched as it flows through a microfluidic channel, and this microfluidic channel is actually developed for this DNA mapping. Now this technique not only provide the location of the restriction sites or fluorescent leveling of site, but it also preserve the order of the restriction or fluorescent leveling of sites within this DNA molecule. And this DNA mapping method, this single DNA molecule mapping method, is actually based on direct imaging of individual DNA molecules and localization of multiple sequence motifs on this molecule.
Okay.
So this individual genetic molecules are labeled with the fluorescent dye at very specific sequence motifs, and the sequence specific leveling starts with introducing the nicks in the double-stranded DNAs at specific sites, and these sites are actually recognized by the endonucleases, and we know that there are some endonucleases which can cleave only one strand of dsDNA substrate.
Yeah.
Now same thing happens, the DNA polymerase comes and incorporates those fluorescent dye terminator at these nicking sites, and now currently there are actually 6 commercially available nicking endonucleases, and these are all produced by New England Biolabs, and they have and the recognition, their unique recognition sequence motifs range from 3 to 7 base pair longs. And these labeled DNA molecules are stretched into this linear form and then imaged onto the modified glass surface. And the distribution of the sequence motifs where these fluorescent dyes have attached, they are actually done by nicking these endonucleases, and it can be done with great accuracy. And with this approach, people have already constructed sequence motif map of lambda phage. They have already established, they used a particular strain. They also use this to develop a sequence the strain of human adenovirus and several strains of this rhinovirus and all different kind of thing. And because of the simplicity of this mapping strategy, this single DNA molecule analysis, high accuracy, and obviously high potential of high throughput, right? And due to this particular application it will likely find applications in several kind of medical diagnostics, DNA mapping, and essentially in rapid identification of these microbial pathogens. And we know that this rapid detection is actually much more required at this kind of state, right? So though people is yet I recently came across a group who is actually trying to who were trying to develop this not recently, I mean a few months back I read a paper where these people were actually trying to develop a detection technique of the coronavirus detection technique by this particular mapping method. But you know that mm, mapping and doing this individually is going to take a is going to increase the cost,
Yeah.
but it is highly accurate and it's really fast. It's faster than the RT-PCR, so that's why people are trying to use this as a detection technique, because generally you know that this is not a very lethal strain, but if some lethal strain comes then the time is of matter, right?
Yeah.
And that's why. So therefore people has already tried to apply this to find several viral genomes also. And as I've already told you that the sequence motif map of both adenovirus, human adenovirus, and rhinovirus were constructed to demonstrate the capability of this approach to rapidly map and identify pathogen genomes. And people have already tried to do this for coronavirus also. But this is a reported thing of this which they did for human adenovirus. Now, now this genome of human adenovirus is actually 35.5 kb long. Okay, and it has a and the distribution of this particular site, this NB BBVC1 site, is actually shown in this particular figure. Okay, these are the point where this particular BBVC sites are present.
Okay.
And this genome actually contains 9 BBVC1 sites. Now, of this 9, 7 are actually resolvable, because you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because rest, this 5 and 6, these are so close together that you cannot identify those two sites as separate site.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this figure B, you can, if you look at this figure B, this is actually a false color 2-channel composite image. Okay. And this shows several fully stretched DNA molecules, and this blue color is due to the yo-yo strain. Okay,
Yes.
this is due to the yo-yo, and you can see that all 7 resolvable MBBVC1 sites, and these sites are labeled with a TAMRA, which is usually a green color. You can see, right? These dots, these are those 7 sites. So a total of 105 DNA molecules were used in constructing this sequence motif map, as you can see in this particular figure. And generally 7 peaks were found at unique locations of 2.8, then 10.9, 10.9, then 15.3, and all these locations, just from a single end. And when you compare them to the exact position, see the exact position is 3.34. Okay, and 3.3, then 11.1, right, and 15.2. These are the exact location. So see that difference is not that much, right? This is the obtained result, but you can see the difference is not that much. And based on previously published phylogenetic analysis of this human adenovirus genome sequence, this virtual sequence of motif map of this BBVC1 site of several adenovirus genome were constructed. And clearly this particular image maps 6 major type of human adenovirus. They have mapped them, and they are quite full length DNA were generated by reverse transcription followed by PCR and other things. Now, to see if one could use this approach to identify a viral isolate, people conducted a set of studies in which the identities of these viral strains were unknown to those performing the experiment and to the data analyst. And 4 anonymous strains of human rhinovirus were obtained from this collaborators of this experiment. And the full length dsDNA were generated by this reverse transcription and by using this long range PCR as before. And after the DNA nicking with this a particular enzyme, and then they labeled it with the TAMRA. Okay, and the optical map of 4 viral strains were actually obtained and analyzed. And these strains were actually new strains were identified, and by comparing the predicted sequence motif match with the constructed map, they are found to be completely different. So that's why they could gather that this is a novel strain. Now, even the strains of this closely related subtype can be quite easily distinguished. And therefore one can distinguish the different viral strains by just comparing the map obtained experimentally with the known virtual sequence of motif maps. So you see, suppose now you know that people subsequently, some people who have already been who have already suffered from coronavirus is getting affected second time, right? Now, this might happen due to two reasons. One of them is that the second time a different strain of coronavirus has affected them. So, though people have developed the antibody and the resistance to strain A, they are really susceptible to strain B, C, D, and E, F, other things. So, these experiments make it really easy to identify if that second coronavirus infection that you are getting, is it from the strain A or from a different strain. And if we can map this, then we are surely going to know that what kind of strains are present in our country, right? Because there has been no current strategy or experiment that could clearly show that how many type of coronavirus or different strains of coronavirus are present in our country. So this is a really easy experiment where you can do and identify different strains of coronavirus, and you can begin the treatment as such, right? And apart from that, people also use this on rhinovirus, and you know that this human rhinovirus is a RNA virus, right? And the length of the rhinovirus is actually only 7.2 kilobases. And for this they also use the same but a different kind of map. For that they used NBBSM map, okay, and they constructed the same thing, and they also were used this approach to identify the viral isolate, and they conducted a set of studies in which the identities of these viral strains were unknown to those performing the experimental data analysis. And like this, 4 anonymous strains of human rhinovirus were obtained from the same categories or the same category of scientists. So we know that using this we can easily create and generate and identify the different strains of viruses that are present, right? So this is a really easy example, and it is easy to perform than RT-PCR, and also much easier than performing the whole genome sequencing. Right. So in this case, you need not perform the whole NGS sequencing of the entire sequence, right? You just need to know the unique restriction sites, attach a particular fluorescent dye to those areas, nick them, and then just a microscopic image is going to tell you the different sites present. Okay. So this is one of the other application of this NGS mechanism. Now we're going to discuss this molecular haplotyping. Now, do you know what is haplotype?
Haplotype, it's just a variant of the same gene.
Yeah, absolutely right. So what happens that haplotype is actually things that they are a set of DNA variations that tend to get inherited together because they are very close together, right? And they get actually inherited together because they are not generally crossovers or recombinations between these markers or between these different polymorphisms, because they are very, very close. And we know that if two sequences are very close together, then it's really hard to form a recombination, so that a recombination might occur in between them, because for recombination to occur, two sequences must be separated by a certain amount of distance, right? And that's why they simply get inherited together. And so a haplotype can actually refer to a combination of alleles in a single gene, or it could be alleles across multiple genes. And sometimes this it could also be a single nucleotide polymorphism that are not in a gene but in between the genes. Okay. Now, basically, it just means that these are variations in the DNA that are so close together that they tend not to recombine, and they therefore tend to be passed down through generations together. Now, the International HapMap project has actually given us a very excellent tool to detect these regions of haplotypes that are passed together and to use those in the genetic studies.
Okay.
Now, the power to detect the association in a genetic study is greatly enhanced when one compares this haplotype of the case and controls rather than working exclusively with the SNPs.
Okay.
But determining this haplotype in a diploid individual is a major technical challenge because we need a reliable and accurate and a high throughput molecular haplotyping technology. Okay, now this single molecule barcoding method is used to determine these haplotypes by directly imaging multiple polymorphic sites on individual DNA molecules simultaneously. Now this method also starts with a long-range PCR amplification of target DNA segment which contains this polymorphic site, and then it is followed by an allele specific labeling of polymorphic alleles with fluorescent dye molecules, and then it is imaged. Then you obviously you have to linearly stretch the single DNA molecule and image them, and afterward determines the nature and position of these fluorescent dyes along the whole DNA molecule. And by determining this colors and position of this fluorescent level with respect to the backbone at the polymorphic site, the haplotype may be inferred with great accuracy, and even when the DNA fragments are not fully labeled. Okay, and this feasibility of this approach is actually demonstrated by the determination of this haplotype of a 10 kb DNA fragment which contains 4 SNPs in a region of human chromosome 17, and these are regions and these haplotypes are actually linked to the subset, and they actually makes the person susceptible to the skin disease psoriasis. Okay, and by this people have already identified that this kind of haplotypes are really present, and whenever you're going to find this kind of haplotypes, you know that the particular person is going to suffer from psoriasis. So what happens, if I see that there are two red green pattern in a gene in that chromosome 17, that means that particular person suffers from psoriasis. But if I have a green red green, then that means you are safe from that particular psoriasis disease. Okay, so see, this kind of mapping is not asking you to analyze and sequence the whole DNA elements, right? It's only allowing you to simply take the whole picture, but obviously using the NGS technology. But rather than sequencing the whole segment, it's asking you to take the image, and that's much more easier. Okay, and using this direct haplotype of this human DNA sample has been demonstrated with this particular technology, and it could again determine this 4 kind of SNPs. Okay, now they simply studied this whole chromosome 17 and they marked it at 4 locations. You can know either there are C2T change in this particular, then there is A2G change, G2A change, or G2A change at both this location, and lastly you have a C2T change at this particular location. Now, as before, all these alleles were tagged with this gap filled padlock probes. Okay, and in this case the G and C were labeled with Psi5 and both with Psi5, the G and C, and the A and T were tagged with Psi3.
Okay,
Psi5 and Psi3. Now there was an additional green channel dye that was introduced at one end during the long range PCR, okay, by using a Psi3 labeled primer, and this end label was used to indicate the orientation of the DNA molecule, because while imaging you don't know if this portion is the 3' end or this portion is the 3' end. So generally what they did, they tagged this particular end, a particular 3' end, to mark that this is the 3' end or the 5' end. So whenever this green fluorescence is present, we know that this is the orientation of DNA. Okay. Now, uh, now this particular figure, this is actually the false color composite image of all these three channels from a typical experiment with this DNA sample, and they were taken from an individual who is heterozygous at all 4 SNPs.
Okay.
Okay. Now, most of these DNA fragments are fully stretched, and some fully stretched DNA molecules show more than one internal level. Can you see? See this? This is showing more than one internal level.
Yeah.
It is showing a green and also a red fluorescence.
Red. Yeah.
Right? That means it is why? Because that means it has a heterozygous allele present there. Okay. Had it been homozygous, we would have gotten only a particular set of fluorescence level color.
Yeah.
Right? Now, now this current leveling efficiency is about 25% for each SNP, and one should find that an average of these 4 DNA fragments out of 1000 DNA molecules with all 4 polymorphic site leveled. And considering the fact that about 40% of these DNA fragments are fully stretched and therefore suitable for this analysis, one has to scan almost 2500 or 3000 of DNA molecules. Okay. But because of the spatial localization of this fluorescent dye is very accurate, some partially labeled DNA fragment can be used to assemble the haplotype, as long as they fulfill all the 3 criteria. And what are the criteria? First, the labeled DNA fragment must be fully stretched so that the label position may be accurately determined. Because if this fragment is not fully stretched, what will happen?
You find all the haplotypes together.
Yeah. Why? Because it is a coiled structure, right? So once I have a coiled structure, that means usually these are going to come very close together. Even though they are separated by almost 17 to 15 base pair, or let's say they are separated by 100 base pairs. But once they are coiled, if they are coiled together, then what will happen? They are going to be close together, and it will be sometimes impossible to distinguish which the exact location of those fluorescence marker.
Yeah.
So that's why you need to stretch the whole DNA. That should be the first criteria, that we have to have a fully stretched DNA. And the second criteria would be they must have this end labeled green fluorescence. That will allow them to be oriented and aligned properly, right? And the third is that this DNA fragment must have at least 2 polymorphic site leveled to show the haplotype relation between them. Because if you have a very small, suppose you have this 958 base pairs, okay, so see, these are only showing green fluorescence, okay, so that means these are really small enough so that they are only showing this end level, but you don't know this fluorescence is coming from this only end level or from this particular SNPs.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why you must have at least 2 polymorphic site in this particular fragment, so that it becomes much easier to analyze. And that's why we see this fragment. This is the end level fragment, but we have this 2 red fragment. That means it has C and G at these unique locations. Not even C, because this C is very close to this C. But if you see the picture and match them, then they know that this is this site. See, RS734232. What is this site? RS734232. So this is the site that is showing that this particular DNA has guanines rather than adenine. That's why it is showing red color. Whereas this is the site 4, which is RS745318. This shows that this is a red color. That means these both of them have G and C. And whereas this particular sequence, it is showing
Green.
green color. That means at this particular site 4, it has thymine, right? See, at site 4 it has thymine, at site 2 it has adenine. Okay, and this is a site 1. Since they are mixed, this is the site 1 because they are really close together, right?
Yeah.
But since this has, you can see a red fluorescence, right?
Yeah.
So that means this has a cytosine. So that means recombination has occurred between
Yeah.
them. So that's why it has A and T from this fragment, but it has a cytosine at this fragment. Understood?
Yeah.
So that's how we can determine this direct this human samples and where is the actual position between them. Okay. Now no. Okay. Now once all these level positions are determined, each observed level is then actually matched to a known locus. And for a given fragment, we generate all possible locus level matching, and that should be consistent with maintaining the observed linear order for these levels. Okay. Now in this case, they were determined by these alleles of SNP3, SNP33, SNP34, and with the alleles being G means SNP33 and SNP34. Okay. Now another fragment with the same three internal levels are shown in this particular lower inlet, right?
Yeah.
Now then they actually score this, and this score is then actually multiplied by the number of levels. And reflecting, it actually reflects that the increased confidence in the locus level matching that comes from this having multiple level present. Now apart from it, you have to maintain a running score, and this running score is actually kept for all possible haplotypes, and along with it you have the score for the fragment is actually added this score for appropriate haplotypes, because if a fragment has very fewer levels than there are number of loci, then it may correspond to several possible haplotypes.
Yeah.
Right? I know that I must have 4 colors, but suppose if I take this fragment, then I don't know that what this fragment means.
Yeah.
Does this mean a end level, or does this mean site 1? Understood?
Yeah.
So that's why I need to have multiple haplotype levels present in my fragment, or it will be difficult for you to identify the end level. But you can go through with this color by but that's not possible. Why? Because it can only identify 3 colors, right? So I'm already adding this blue yo-yo strain to the DNA backbone. I'm having red and I'm having green. So until and unless people determine and can generate more technology so that it can identify more than 3 colors, because once it can identify 4 colors, then the end level color will be completely different.
Yeah.
Right? We can add a yellow color to this end, and that means any yellow color is going to show me that that's the end level, and that would make the life much easier. And yes, people are actually working, and this is in a beta state. They have recently we have been given a demonstration of how this 4 color method works, but they have not they are yet to manufacture it for public, and they are actually testing it, which has to go through stringent testing, right? Because it's a multi-million-dollar project and all, and it's actually done by Thermo Fisher. Yeah. And okay, so now after this top scored haplotype is actually taken, and then it is then it is shown to you as in a data format in this software. And in this particular case, you can see that all the scores for all these various loci will be given, and the score for this particular haplotype they are going to show that the score for this haplotype is more than 30% higher than the next highest scored haplotype pair, and that's how you can understand that which haplotype is majorly present in your particular cell, and what kind of pathogenicity you might be suffering from. Because sometimes if you are doing this in a genetic element of person, then obviously that corresponds to a medical condition, right? And that's how you can indicate that this particular person or this is going to suffer from this kind of disease or like this. And but in this experiment, all this result was actually also confirmed by the parental genotyping of all the 4 SNPs. They took the sample from parent and they analyzed all of them to further qualify and say that whether this haplotype is inherited from the parents or not. Okay. And actually that from the results of this parental, it confirmed that this all 4 positions are actually heterozygous, and therefore because all the 4 positions show instances of both Psi5 and Psi3 together. Okay. Okay. So that was all about this whole NGS technique and whole NGS. And I think by next week I'm going to take a class on this NGS data analysis. Okay. I'm going to have a data available, and you are going to show you how to analyze these data and all. Okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay, sure. So this is all about NGS done. So next what we do, we will start with the proteomics part.
Okay, sure.
Okay, we'll start with proteomics and from protein modeling, and then we're going to go for, after that we're going to go for this genomics later. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so just wait a minute, let me start the proteomics. Okay, so in this particular topic we'll start with proteomics, and of course proteomics needs a basic understanding about protein structures and all. Okay, so today I'm just going to give you a brief description about what is proteomics and what is not, etc. And then we're going to start with the basic structure of protein structuring and molecule and all. Okay, but before that I require you to download a particular software, that is PyMol, onto your computer. I'm sending you the link. It is freely available. We are going to require this software for our use, so simply download this. It's a free to download. Yeah, I think you just have to fill up a form and all. That's all. And okay, so what we're going to start with, the basic proteomics, then we'll go to the structural bioinformatics part. Okay, and later on then we'll shift to the in this structural proteomics we're going to talk about this protein structure and all, and basic things. Okay, the homology modeling, the difference between homology modeling, ab initio modeling, protein threading and all. Okay. Okay, so first thing first, what is proteomics?
Study of protein.
Study of proteins. Yes, that's one thing to say, the study of proteins. But you are adding an S to it, right? Proteins.
Yeah, or protein.
Yeah, so generally what happens is that when people work, or generally I also work, I generally tend to work with a particular protein. Which has some significance in this. I work in cancer biology, so I know that I have to target the protein which generally gets overexpressed in kind of cancer, and against who a particular drug is there is no drug. So I have to design a drug against a particular protein, and what is the function of that protein, what's the structure of protein, and all. Okay, but generally this proteomics is actually a study of a whole proteome of your body. Now the whole proteome means it means that all the proteins in your body.
Okay.
And why is it I'm shifting from a single protein to a whole protein in the body? Because if I talk about whole protein in the body, there are almost thousands of different kind of proteins in your body, right? They're constantly being expressed, they're constantly being transcribed, they have some function. After that function is over, they get degraded. So this cycle goes on. But why I am interested about studying the whole protein of the cell rather than a particular subset of only a single protein and all.
Because they are all together. Because they are all interacting together.
Yes, because they are interconnected together. Why? Because we have seen that a particular some protein acts as a transcription factor. Okay, so if you think about there's a pathway called BCL2 VEGF pathway, and on that pathway the pathway goes on like this, that there is c-Myc protein. The c-Myc protein is actually a transcription factor of E2F protein. Okay,
Yeah.
Now this E2F1 is again a transcription factor of BCL2, and this it's a transcription factor of VEGF, and VEGF is a transcription factor of BCL2. So now if I'm targeting this c-Myc protein, now if my intention is to reduce the expression of c-Myc protein or to destroy the c-Myc protein, then what will happen? Subsequently, since it's a transcription factor of E2F1, the expression of E2F1 is going to go down.
Yeah.
And as a result, the expression of VEGF will go down, and as a result, expression of BCL2 will go down. So this is a particular, all of this will happen in chain. But when I'm studying with only a particular protein, I'm not worried about what is the implication of decreasing concentration of all this protein in my body. They might have some other application, or they might harm my body in some other way, right?
Yeah.
So that's why people shifted from a single protein study to a proteome study.
Proteins.
Just to know that how affecting a single protein is affecting the overall cellular structure or the whole chemical biology of your cell that is regulated by the protein. And generally every interaction or everything that happens in our body, it happens due to protein-protein interaction or protein-DNA interaction.
Yeah.
Be it a hormone, be it a a messenger, anything, all of them are proteins, right? Even if you think about antibodies, they are protein. If you think about those interleukins 1, interleukins 2, they are protein. If you think about anything, all of them are protein. So we need to study the whole protein, and we know this protein is actually not constant in our body.
Yeah.
Why? Because some protein gets expressed when they are required to, and the other time the protein does not get expressed. So suppose in the morning, can you give me an example of a protein which changes according to our circadian rhythm?
Protein. Yeah. Nothing's coming to my mind right now.
Okay, these are actually molecular clocks. For example, have you heard the protein called melatonin?
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. The melatonin.
Yeah. So what happens? Melatonin is a protein. It's a molecular clock, and actually our cell contains this all different kind of tiny molecular clock that measures out the whole 24-hour circadian rhythm. And this clock actually decides when we get hungry, when we get sleepy, and even this clock can sense when the days are getting longer at summer and the days are getting shorter in the winter, and they also trigger these seasonal changes. The major clock in our body is housed in a small region of the brain, and it is called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And this suprachiasmatic nuclei, it acts as a central pacemaker, and it checks the cycle of this light and dark outside, and then it sends the signal to synchronize the body, and it synchronizes those tiny clocks throughout the rest of the body. For example, this protein melatonin, it is actually produced selectively at only night, and it circulates through the blood to coordinate all our nightly activities such as sleep and all. So sometimes people who are actually unable to sleep, there are some due to some stress, mental tension, or due to some other psychiatric conditions, then they are usually treated with melatonin, and that may be used to change their cycle artificially. For example, for helping to shift cycles that are out of phase during the jet lag, and also to allow the people to fall asleep at night who cannot sleep at night, for example, like this. And this daily rise and fall of melatonin is actually caused by the changes in the levels of enzyme. And what is the enzyme? The enzyme is actually serotonin N-acetyl transferase. Okay. Now what happens? There are certain immune parameters in our body, and that also change with time of day, and disruption of the circadian rhythm has actually been linked to the inflammatory pathologies. So sometimes what happens, so at night when before sleeping, if you watch a movie or a TV series in your laptop, or if you work with your mobile screen a lot, then what happens, you get this blue lights into your eyes, right? And once those blue light enters your eye, it hits the suprachiasmatic
Yeah.
nuclei in the brain. And then what happens, it it senses that it's actually daytime. It
Uh-huh.
senses that it's actually day, it's not night.
Yeah.
And so that's why it signals that there should be a low amount of melatonin in your body, and that simply halts your sleep cycle. That's why people, doctors and all, doctors don't know these conditions, the detail, but therefore people generally ask you not to use or watch these movies and all during night, because that simply messes up your whole system. And if this goes on for a long period of time,
Yeah.
then the suprachiasmatic nuclei simply assumes that this is the time to not secrete the melatonin. So it is not going to secrete the melatonin, and that's how the shift cycle changes. Because I have seen actually a sister of my friend. She actually currently she now sleeps at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she sleeps till 2 p.m. and then she wakes up and stays awake the whole night. She can't fall asleep, and that's because for the whole night she either watches movies or that she talks to I don't know who, either with her friend or with her boyfriend, something, someone like that, and it is actually affecting her mentality. And that's how when they went to the doctors, he actually told that yes, whatever might be, you have to stop watching movies and all, and you have to, and actually she has to perform that, he has to do everything, wrap everything around 7, within 7 p.m., and then be at a closed door without any light inside that room, because so that, and doing this for some 15 to 20 days is going to restore restore her normal melatonin cycle and all. Okay, so that's why are you there? Oh.